They called it the Long Peace. 1,000 years of human restraint, wrapped in diplomacy, coated in compromise, and sold to the galaxy as proof that humanity had finally grown up. The conclave of worlds had welcomed Earth into the interstellar fold with cautious optimism, whispering among themselves that perhaps these strange, short-lived mammals from the edge of the Orion Arm were manageable after all. They gave us a seat at the table. They made sure the chair was smaller than all the others. And we said nothing. We smiled. We adapted. We endured. The Theric Empire was the first to test our patience formally. They rerouted the supply lines to the Kepler colonies, 47 inhabited worlds, 9 million human souls, citing a navigational reclassification that no one in the conclave disputed because no one wanted to disrupt the profitable trade routes that skirted those same human systems. Children on Kepler 22c began rationing water. On Kepler 442b, 3 colony ships carrying medical equipment were turned away at the hyperspace relay station without explanation, without apology, and without consequence. The conclave sent a strongly worded resolution. Humanity's ambassador delivered it with steady hands and a steady voice, and swallowed whatever was burning behind his eyes. We filed grievances. We followed procedure. We waited, as we had always waited, because the alternative, the thing that lived beneath the surface of human civilization like magma beneath a quiet mountain, was something we had spent centuries learning to control. Our history made us dangerous. Our discipline made us trustworthy. And so we chose, again and again, to be trustworthy. We buried our dead on those colony worlds, and we returned to the negotiating table, and we believed, with a faith that bordered on the sacred, that patience was a form of strength. The Velthari Dominion disagreed. To them, patience was a form of weakness. They had watched humans defer, retreat, and compromise for 3 centuries and had drawn the only conclusion their hierarchical minds could conceive. We were prey pretending to be predators. When the Dominion began annexing the border systems in 3247, absorbing human-settled stations, and reclassifying their inhabitants as non-sovereign labor assets, the conclave convened an emergency session that lasted 11 months. The resolution they passed had 17 subclauses. It changed nothing. The people in those stations filed new identification documents under Velthari jurisdiction. They were given new names. They were given new jobs. Their old lives were administratively erased. And humanity, impossibly, still did not break. What no one in the galaxy truly understood, what no species paused long enough to comprehend, was that human patience is not passive. It is not weakness wearing a patient face. It is something far more dangerous. It is a species that remembers everything, calculates everything, and chooses, deliberately, and with full understanding of its own power, to wait. Every diplomatic retreat was logged. Every casualty was named. Every injustice was catalogued in the deep memory of a civilization that had survived ice ages and plagues and wars that rewrote the map of an entire planet. We were not enduring because we lacked the power to respond. We were enduring because we understood, better than any species in the galaxy, what happens when we stop. There is a word in an old human language, a word that has no clean translation in any of the 47 official conclave tongues, and that word is forbearance. It does not simply mean patience. It means the active, deliberate, and costly choice to hold back something that has every right to move forward. It means standing at the edge of your own power and choosing, again and again, not to step over. For 300 years, forbearance was the foundation upon which humanity built its interstellar identity. It was also the thing that made everyone else in the galaxy profoundly comfortable. The conclave had grown accustomed to a version of humanity that was palatable. We were innovative, productive, occasionally inspiring, and, most importantly, controllable. Human engineers solved problems, that stumped civilizations 10 times our age. Human doctors had eradicated diseases on worlds that had suffered for millennia. Human diplomats had brokered 17 major peace agreements in sectors we had no territorial claim to, simply because we were good at it, simply because we cared. We gave, and we gave, and we gave, and the galaxy accepted our gifts with the quiet entitlement of those who have never known what it costs to be generous from a position of need. Behind closed doors, in the security councils and think tanks and classified briefing rooms that no conclave observer was permitted to attend, humanity's military architects had been doing math for 2 centuries. Not the math of conquest. Not the math of empire. The math of sufficiency. Exactly how much force would be required to protect every human life in every system if the long peace ever broke. They ran simulations. They modeled scenarios. They built fleets that they prayed would rust in dry dock forever. Every admiral who entered those rooms was required to read one document before assuming command, a historical record of every war humanity had ever fought on its home planet, compiled not as a source of pride, but as a warning. This is what we are capable of, the document said. This is why we do not begin. What the galaxy did not know, what no intelligence service had fully penetrated or believed, was that those fleets existed. Clean and cold, and waiting in the dark between stars, the Terran Strategic Reserve was not a rumor or a diplomatic fiction. It was real, and it was vast, and it had been quietly expanded every decade for 200 years by a civilization that hoped it would never be used and prepared for it as though its use were inevitable. Every new annexation, every ignored grievance, every resolution that changed nothing. Each one added another ship, another battalion, another orbital platform to a force that no one in the Conclave's comfortable center had ever been permitted to audit. They assumed human military power was proportional to human political assertiveness. It was not. It was the opposite. The Dravaki Syndicate made the mistake of capturing one of our research vessels in 3251. The crew, 23 scientists and 4 crew members, were held for 14 months while the Conclave negotiated. They were returned, eventually, but not without cost, not without damage. When the last of them came home and the medical reports were sealed under diplomatic confidentiality, something shifted in the human civilian population that no politician could fully reverse. The protests were quiet at first. Then they were not. The Conclave had miscalculated in a way that would prove historic. They had shown humanity what deference cost in human faces, human bodies, human lives. And humanity had finally, after centuries of looking away, looked directly at the bill. The moment historians would later identify as the turning point was not a battle. It was a vote. On the 14th of March, 3257, the Terran Unified Assembly convened in full session for the first time in 60 years and passed, by a margin of 91%, the Sovereignty Restoration Act. It was 22 pages long. It was precise and calm and written in language so careful it almost obscured the magnitude of what it actually said. What it said, in the language that mattered, was this: we are done asking permission to exist. Every border violation, every ignored resolution, every human life reclassified or lost or abandoned by a conclave that had chosen comfort over justice, all of it would now be addressed. Not debated. Addressed. The galaxy did not believe it at first. The conclave ambassadors read the document and convened a panel. The panel produced a report. The report recommended a counter-resolution. They had been doing this for 3 centuries, and it had always worked, because humanity had always, eventually, accepted the process as a substitute for the outcome. They did not understand that the people voting in that assembly chamber were the grandchildren of the scientists taken by the Dravaki, the children of the colonists, who had rationed water on Kepler 22c, the descendants of every human being who had ever been told that their suffering was a regrettable but necessary feature of interstellar diplomacy. They did not understand that patience, when it finally ends, does not end gradually. It ends all at once. Within 72 hours of the Act's passage, the Terran Strategic Reserve began moving. Not charging. Not attacking. Moving, repositioning with a calm, coordinated precision that made every military analyst in the conclave sit forward in their chairs and recalculate. The scale was wrong. The scale was impossible. Ships that no one had known existed materialized at relay stations, at hyperspace junctions, at the borders of every system where a human grievance had been logged and ignored. They did not fire. They did not threaten. They transmitted, on every open channel, a single document, the complete record of every human life lost, displaced, or harmed under conclave governance. Every name. Every date. Every unanswered petition. It was not a declaration of war. It was something more unsettling. It was a ledger. It was proof that we had been paying attention the entire time. The Theric Empire's Grand Admiral reportedly read the first 300 pages before setting the document down and requesting an immediate private channel to the Terran embassy. He would later describe the experience as reading the biography of his own civilization's arrogance. The Velthari Dominion's High Council went into emergency session and did not emerge for 4 days. When they did, they had a different word for humans than the one they had been using. They no longer said manageable. They said awake. The Dravaki Syndicate, calculating rapidly in the way that mercantile civilizations always do, began drafting reparation proposals within hours. They had not been afraid of humanity before. They were afraid of humanity now, not because humans had changed, but because they had finally understood what humans had always been. What broke them was not the weapons or the fleet numbers, though those were staggering enough. What broke them was the composure. Every human commander who appeared on communication channels wore the same expression, not rage, not triumph, not the savage hunger of a predator finally unleashed. They were calm. Profoundly, terribly calm. They had been angry for a long time. They had processed the anger, refined it, distilled it into something far more dangerous than fury. They had turned it into clarity. And clarity, in a species with humanity's history and humanity's capabilities, was the most frightening thing the galaxy had ever seen. There is a Velthari phrase,
Readings
loosely
confirm no
translated,
anomalies detected.
that means
Proceeding to
something
next
like
section.
the horror of the gentle giant finally rising. It did not exist before 3257. It was coined in the weeks that followed the repositioning, as conclave species began quietly, urgently, honestly reassessing everything they thought they knew about the civilization they had been casually mistreating for 3 centuries. Xenopsychology departments at universities across the galaxy began pulling up archive footage of human diplomatic sessions, watching with new eyes the moments where a human ambassador had accepted an outcome that was clearly unjust. They had read those moments as compliance. They understood now that they had been watching restraint. They had seen a species choosing not to respond and had mistaken it for a species incapable of responding. The error was catastrophic in its simplicity. The conclave itself fractured along predictable lines. The species, who had most benefited from human deference, argued for de-escalation, for dialogue, for the very processes they had corrupted into instruments of delay. The species, who had always been quietly uneasy about the way humanity was treated, the Solhari Collective, the Meridian clans, said nothing publicly but repositioned their own assets closer to human space. Not in opposition. In alignment. Because they had understood something that the Theric and the Velthari and the Dravaki had missed. Humans, when finally moving, do not move alone. 3 centuries of genuine goodwill, of solved problems and brokered peace, and gifted medicine and shared technology, had built something that no conclave resolution could manufacture. It had built trust. Real trust, earned through cost and sacrifice, held by species who had benefited from human generosity and had never forgotten it. Aboard the TFS Endurance, flagship of the newly designated First Restoration Fleet, Admiral Yara Oseminsa sat in her command chair and watched the tactical display with the quiet focus of someone who had trained her entire career for a moment she had hoped would never come. She had read the ledger document before it was transmitted. All of it. She had read it not as a commander preparing for conflict, but as a human being reading the accumulated cost of her civilization's dignity. When she set it down, she had not felt rage. She had felt something older and steadier than rage, something that people in her ancestral traditions might have called righteousness. Not the righteousness of certainty or superiority, but the righteousness of someone who has been patient for good reasons, who has followed every rule and honored every agreement and absorbed every injustice in good faith, and who has finally arrived at the place where patience and justice are no longer compatible. She did not want war. No one in that fleet wanted war. That was perhaps the hardest thing for the other species to accept, that the humans who had built this vast, quiet, terrifying force had done so while sincerely hoping it would never be necessary, and that even now, even with every grievance recorded and every fleet positioned and every calculation completed, their first action had been to transmit a document rather than fire a weapon. They were offering, one final time, the chance to make it right without making it worse. The ledger was not a threat. It was an invitation. It said, "We have always known what we were capable of, and we have always chosen to be better than that. Now we are asking you to choose to be better too." The galaxy had approximately 72 hours to decide whether it would accept that invitation or discover what happened next. Across the conclave's thousands of inhabited worlds, on every species' communication networks, the question was the same: what do they want? And the answer that came back from every human official, every ambassador, every recorded statement was identical in its simplicity. Accountability. Not revenge. Not territory. Not the dismantlement of the conclave or the humiliation of its members. They wanted names matched to consequences. They wanted borders honored. They wanted their people. The ones reclassified, the ones rationed, the ones taken and returned damaged. They wanted all of it acknowledged, formally and permanently, by the civilizations responsible. They wanted the galaxy to say, out loud, in binding legal language, "You are people, and what was done to you was wrong." After 300 years, that was still all they wanted. The reckoning, when it came, was not a war. This is the part that history books across a dozen civilizations still struggle to categorize, because the frameworks available, conquest, conflict, revolution, do not adequately describe what happened in the 8 months that followed the Sovereignty Restoration Act. What happened was closer to a moral audit of the galaxy's most powerful governing body, conducted at the barrel of a civilization's patience finally reaching its end. It was not bloodless. There were confrontations in the border systems, skirmishes where Velthari commanders, who had not received or had chosen to ignore the new political reality, attempted to enforce the old order. Those confrontations ended quickly and decisively, and the after-action reports from the human side were notable for what they did not contain: any language of triumph, any glorification of violence, any rhetoric of superiority. The reports were clinical. They described actions taken to protect lives and enforce legitimate claims. Nothing more. The conclave's formal restructuring took 4 years. Human delegates, now negotiating from a position that everyone in the room understood very differently, drafted the Charter of Sovereign Dignity, a document that restructured the foundational legal frameworks of interstellar governance. It was not a human document in its vision. It was a universal one, drawn from the most progressive elements of conclave jurisprudence and the hard-won lessons of Earth's own troubled history with power and oppression. Humans wrote it precisely because they understood, better than any civilization that had never experienced systematic subjugation, what protections actually needed to be in place and why. They wrote it with the memory of what it cost to be without those protections, and they wrote it for every species in the conclave, not just their own. What changed, permanently and irreversibly, was not the political landscape, though that changed enormously. What changed was something harder to map and impossible to undo: the galaxy's understanding of what humanity actually was. Every species had their own mythology about humans before 3257, the short-lived mammals, the chaotic innovators, the frustratingly sentimental diplomats who cried at the funerals of people they had never met. After 3257, those myths did not disappear. They were joined by something new: a recognition, an understanding that ran through every culture and every species and every political faction in the conclave like a current that could not be switched off. Humans had been patient not because they were weak, but because they genuinely believed in the possibility of better. They had endured not because they lacked options, but because they were willing to pay a terrible personal cost in the hope that the galaxy could evolve without catastrophe. And when that hope finally, conclusively, exhausted itself, when the last petition was filed, and the last grievance ignored, and the last human name added to a ledger that had been growing for 3 centuries, they had moved with a precision and a discipline that made it absolutely clear: the patience had always been a choice. It had never been a limitation. Admiral Osemensa was asked, in the deposition that would become one of the most widely translated documents in the post-conclave era, what she would say to the species who had misread humanity's restraint as submission. She was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that her species had perfected over centuries of choosing when to speak and when to wait. Then she said, "We held the door open for as long as we could. We kept asking you to come through it with us. We are sorry it took this long for you to understand that we were always capable of walking through it ourselves." She paused. "We would have preferred you came willingly." That was the sentence the galaxy could not forget. Not the fleet deployments, or the ledger, or the strategic repositioning, or even the charter. It was that sentence, spoken quietly by a woman with steady hands and steady eyes, that echoed through the politics and philosophy and cultural memory of 100 civilizations for generations to come. No species that lived through those years ever fully recovered the comfortable assumption that patience meant powerlessness. No ambassador ever again sat across from a human delegate and believed that deference was compliance. And no civilization that heard the full accounting of what humanity had absorbed, silently, deliberately, at enormous cost to its own people, ever again made the mistake of calling humanity manageable. They had held the door open. For 300 years, they had held it, and when they finally let it close, every species in the galaxy heard it, and every species understood, in the deep and irrevocable way that truth settles into culture and stays there forever. The most terrifying thing in the universe was never humanity's fury. It was humanity's patience. Because patience, in a species that old and that capable and that wounded, meant that every response was measured. Every action was chosen. Every consequence was intentional. They had not snapped. They had decided. And the galaxy would spend the rest of its history learning the difference.